Our next speaker is Dr. David Hopkins, professor of art history at the University of Glasgow. David has made many wonderful contributions to the body of literature about and around Marcel Duchamp over the last number of years, a number of which I've been very privileged to use as text in various courses that I have taught and have read over the years quite eagerly. Today he's going to look at a photograph. We've seen an example of it already on the screen, and I think it's one that we all know quite well, under the label of dust breeding. The photograph, however, when published in October 1922 issue of Literature, was accompanied by a most interesting title, The Domaine of Rose C'est la Vie. In his paper entitled The Domaine of Rose C'est la Vie, Duchamp's Dust Breeding as a Portrait, David considers the way in which the image can be construed as a portrait of Marcel Duchamp, another way of inventing a look at Duchamp. David Hopkins.
How do I get my presentation up? Do you know? Anybody? This one?
Yeah, and if you want it, that's a laser pointer.
Don't know.
Okay. Here we go.
Just put it on the slide.
Yes.
Sure.
Oh, does it have animation? Sorry.
No. Okay, thanks. Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks, Anne. Yes, but yeah, thanks again to Anne and to Jim for inviting me to come here to speak in this examination of subject of Duchamp portraiture. And my focus in this presentation will be an image which does not appear to be a portrait of any kind, or at least not a conventional one. Dust breeding is a photograph normally ascribed to Man Ray and Duchamp in collaboration, which on first viewing appears to picture some form of extraterrestrial landscape. In what follows, we'll discover that what appears to be one thing is in fact another. Scale will change, viewpoint alter, meaning shift. By the end of this paper, I hope to show that dust breeding is in fact a form of portrait of Duchamp, or rather a double portrait of Duchamp and his other half, Rose C'est la Vie. But even the concept of a portrait will need to alter, to embrace the idea of the figuring of absence or presence withheld. Like water in the desert, identity will prove to be a mirage. The photograph of dust breeding was first published in the October 1922 edition of the Paris Dada group's journal Literature in Paris. It was an image of the build-up of dust on the surface of Marcel Duchamp's large glass as the work rested on trestle tables in the artist's New York studio in mid-1920. The photograph seems to have arisen out of a meeting between Man Ray and Duchamp concerning the latter's rotary discs for the period. The two men apparently went out for lunch, leaving the camera to take a long exposure of the surface of the glass in artificial light. In the photograph, we see an angled and relatively close-up view of the dust lying on the bottom half or bachelor's domain of the work. As is widely known, the dust would eventually provide the coloration for the so-called sieves or drainage slopes in the bachelor's domain. Having let it settle for some 6 months, Duchamp wiped away that which he didn't need and stuck it down with varnish. The relation of this photograph to ideas about the passage of time, chance, and photographic indexicality, which have been explored by the likes of Rosalind Krauss and David Campany, will not concern me here. And I will return to the thematic of dust shortly. But first I want to concentrate on the caption which was appended to the photograph when it was reproduced for the first time by the Paris Dada group, and say a little about their relation to Duchamp. As reproduced in Littérature, the photograph carried the following caption in translation. View from an airplane on the right, and here is the domain of Rose c'est la vie, how arid it is, how fertile, how joyous, how sad on the left. The first part of the caption relates fairly directly to an account that Man Ray would later give of the genesis of the image. This is view from an airplane. He talked of the dust on the work, resembling some strange landscape seen from a bird's eye view, adding, "There was dust on the work and bits of cotton wadding that had been used to clean up the finished parts." But we should remember that the image was actually produced in 1920, and the captioning from the Paris-based Dadaists, all of them fervent admirers and interpreters of the enigmatic Duchamp, came 2 years later. Man Ray's account of the photograph as a bird's eye view, which came in his autobiography of 1963, may be a retrospective formulation of ideas that had been developed as much by the Paris Dadaists as Duchamp and himself. In what follows, I often make the assumption that Duchamp and Man Ray, gazing at the photograph they had produced of the glass, saw an immediate connection with aerial photography, or actually set up the image in this way. But there's no clear evidence for this. However, if we look at the photograph from which the image in Littérature was cropped, which has only recently come to light, we get a greater sense of the degree of manipulation carried out by Duchamp and Man Ray in the photograph as published. In the original image, the templates, which were presumably used to establish the shapes of the sieves in the bachelor's domain, remain in place to provide a record of studio activity. In the final image, all of this paraphernalia is eliminated, and the white wall beyond the edge of the table is made to function as an implacable sky above a landscape ending abruptly at an impossibly straight horizon. The second part of the caption, "This is the domain of Rose c'est la vie," and so forth, is clearly even more loaded and sparks off a complex account of the way the image was understood by the Dada group in France. Rose c'est la vie was the alter ego Duchamp had invented for himself in a series of photographs and ready-made gestures from about the mid-1920s onwards. In other words, from around the time dust breeding was created. We all know Rose by now. The Paris Dada group had heard of this mysterious creation of the New York-based Duchamp by 1922, not least from Duchamp himself, who had been in Paris in the latter part of 1921. They may well have pondered how her name, which, as well as suggesting the pun, suggesting love is life, Rose c'est la vie, also suggests water or sprinkle life, arroser la vie, resonated with Duchamp's reputation for being a dry type. Hence, one way to read the caption is to see Rose's fertility in counterpoint to the dryness, or dustiness perhaps, of her other half, Marcel Duchamp. It's hardly surprising, in fact, that in his first essay on Duchamp, produced around the time of the dust-breeding photograph, André Breton should talk of Duchamp as, quote, an oasis for those who are still searching, deliberately playing, no doubt, on these notions of deserts and watering holes. It seems as though the French poets understood the dry Duchamp to have made way for his fertile other half, to have killed off his former self, and this may well be the way Duchamp encouraged them to think. But I'll return to Rose again shortly. But now I think we should pursue the deathly inflection that I've just mentioned slightly differently. Given that the dust-breeding image was captioned view from an aeroplane, what further emerges from contemplation of the mournful or elegiac tone of the caption is that there may well be an allusion here to aerial photographs of battlefields. There's been much research in recent years on the extent to which the Dadaists registered the physical and mental effects of the First World War, and I would draw attention to Amelia Jones on New York, Bridget Doherty on Berlin, and Amy Lyford on Paris. But nothing's been made of the striking links between Man Ray's photographs and the reconnaissance photographs of battlefields, which were such a key aspect of the imagery thrown up by the war. In Man Ray's previously cited description of the photograph, he talks about the bits of cotton wadding that had been used to clean up the finished parts of the glass, and comparing the photograph with a battlefield photograph taken by an American unit headed by Edward Steichen. It is hard to resist the impression that the cotton wads double as plumes of drifting smoke. A remarkable jump from close-up to aerial view takes place, such that the bachelor zone of the large glass becomes transformed into a scaled-down war zone. The trope of miniaturization seems relevant here. The American literary theorist Susan Stewart talks of a miniaturized war game envisaged by the writer H.G. Wells as a counter-proposition to the war games indulged in by the British Army. Wells wrote, "My game is just as good as their game, and saner by virtue of its size. War is a game out of all proportion." In this context, Duchamp and Man Ray assume the personae of boys playing at warfare. It's important here to note that the aerial view and its implications was already established as a minor genre within avant-garde art production. The marriage of airplane and camera implied in the aerial photograph, the meeting of two technological modes, which was pioneered by Italian pilots in 1911, inaugurated a new mechanized mode of visualizing warfare, which we find exploited, for example, in Max Ernst's photomontage, Massacre of the Innocents, published around the same time as Dust Breeding. Produced around the same time as Dust Breeding. A nightmarish form of military attrition, aerial bombardment, which had also been perfected by the Italians in the bombing of Tripoli in 1911, and which Marinetti lauded in his futurist poem, Le Bataille de Tripoli, now haunted the imagination of artists. Even the visual presentation of Marinetti's words in Freedom, as exemplified in Zong Tum Tum, produced in Adrianople in 1912, borrowed its impetus from an aerial viewpoint. It's worth pausing to assess the enormous psychological repercussions emanating from this annexation of photography to the imaging of the landscape of modern warfare. In a fascinating discussion, Bernd Huphoff has dwelt on the altered modes of perception inaugurated by the alliance of aeroplane and camera. He notes that, quote, "the aerial photographs of the front demonstrate pointedly the new perception and expression of a landscape hitherto unknown, a landscape of complete destruction and high artificiality in terms of its systems of dugouts, trenches, communication lines, supply routes, and so forth." Expanding on the new alienating aesthetic order brought into being, he notes, "The morphology of the landscape of destruction photographed from a plane was transformed into the visual order of an abstract pattern. This is obviously suggestive in relation to the choice made by Man Ray and Duchamp to incorporate the angled vision of the bachelor's apparatus from the large glass, with its enigmatic network of lines, into the dust-breeding image. Is some comment about a new mode of perceptual disorientation being made here? To offset this, It should be asserted that rather than expressing the dizzying effects of aerial perception in a grand artistic statement in the manner of avant-gardists from Marinetti through to Malevich and Rodchenko, Man Ray and Duchamp deliberately conjure their battlefield scenario out of odds and ends of material and from a chance perception, a momentary shift of viewpoint. They avoid any pretense of profundity. They assume, as I've argued elsewhere, the attitude of the amateur bricoleur rather than that of the professional modernist artist, and their collaboration is more closely informed by the spirit of boyish camaraderie than by shared experimental zeal. More precisely, their approach is born out of play rather than moral indignation or aesthetic ambition. And there is, in any case, a considerable degree of ambiguity in the visual conceit they come up with. In the past, dust breeding has often been thought to evoke not so much a battlefield as some kind of ancient earthwork or site, and parallels with the geoglyphs drawn onto the surface of the Nazca Desert in Peru around 300 to 800 AD, and significantly only fully apprehendable from the air, are worth considering. This element of ambiguity in the image, the way it appears to oscillate between picturing a modern landscape of destruction and an ancient site of ritual significance, also chimes in with Hopoff's thoughts on the character of aerial wartime photography. Pursuing his sense of the disparity in aerial images of battlefields between the purely aesthetic effects of the images, and the horrendous sufferings of flesh and blood soldiers that are effectively rendered invisible in them, Hopoff notes that we are returned to modes of cognition characteristic of primitive art. Hence, he writes, there too, knowledge was required for the deciphering of shapes and colours associated with events, demons, totems, or tribes, and their actions in the tribal warfare, adding, visual representation of the modern battlefield in aerial photography is another example of the frequently observed return of archaic structures in the world of modern technology. If Man Ray and Duchamp mobilize a kind of entropic metaphor in their photograph, a slippage from the modern to the archaic, this also reinforces the sense of a regressive strategy in their conception of themselves as artists, a reversion to boyishness. And here the male thematic of their play becomes even more poignant. Dust, the material which coats their miniaturized landscape, is itself evocative of the boy's bedroom, or later perhaps the bachelor's habitat. It seems hardly coincidental that the dust breeding photograph actually isolates the chocolate grinder from the large glass, the part of the work which most closely figures masturbation. Talking about visiting Duchamp's New York studio at approximately the time he was working on the section of the bachelor's domain pictured in the photograph, the American painter Georgia O'Keeffe recalled, "It was a few flights up in a dismal, drafty building. The room looked like it had never been swept, not even when he first moved in. The dust everywhere was so thick it was hard to believe. I was so upset over this dusty place that the next day I wanted to go over and clean it up." Whatever this might say about stereotypical male and female roles, it is evident that dust was something that Duchamp cultivated just as surely as he cultivated his bachelor status. And we are reminded here, of course, about the way the captioning of the photograph in littérature plays on this dry Duchamp. In respect to this cultivation of dust, one should mention that the title of the dust photograph clearly derives from a phrase in Duchamp's set of notes for his large glass, the so-called green box, which reads élevé de la poussière. Strictly speaking, the word élevé here means to raise, although the added connotation of rearing or breeding was supplied when the photograph became élevage de la poussière, which translates more exactly as dust breeding. The implication, then, is that dust has been coaxed forth, made into an active principle in some way. We must also, of course, reconcile this with the fact that dust evokes mourning, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Elaborating on dust's deathly connotations, the historian Carolyn Steadman, in a fascinating discussion of dust's role in the phenomenology of archive fever, dwells on the French 19th century historian Michelet, perusing the musty manuscripts at the Archives Nationales in Paris, and perceiving himself to be literally breathing in via the dust from the documents, the spirits of those who are now, as he said, smothered in the past. As Stedman notes, Michelet